Over the past year, Donald Trump has gone after his critics with a vengeance.
It's about justice, really. It's not revenge. It's about justice. It's also about the fact that you can't let this go on. They are sick, radical left people.
For starters, former FBI Director James Comey was indicted, as was New York Attorney General Letitia James, both of whom were on Trump's list of political enemies. Democratic Senator Mark Kelly is being investigated for what the president calls seditious behavior that is, quote, punishable by death.
We are all afraid. And I'll tell you, I'm oftentimes very anxious myself about using my voice because retaliation is real.
That's Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski speaking in Alaska in early 2025. Trump's on a mission to stifle dissent and shut down opposition. What does history tell us about whether there's any way to stop him? I'm Justin Bergman, the International Affairs Editor at The Conversation in Australia, and this is The Making of an Autocrat, Episode 5, Suppress the People. Lucan Way, you're a professor of democracy at the University of Toronto, and you've been charting the ways the Trump administration has been clamping down on dissent and consolidating power since taking office. Let's start by talking about how autocrats actually come to power. This doesn't always happen through violent means, say a coup or an uprising. Dictators are frequently elected, right?
Historically, like after World War II, most authoritarians were sort of, I guess you might call honest authoritarians, where they came to power through coups and invasion and the like. But now about 2/3 of autocrats are elected in today.
So explain this dichotomy a bit more. How can you have an autocracy in a country that still has elections and an opposition that still has a reasonable chance of winning?
Among sort of what you might call electoral autocracies, some, such as Russia or Uzbekistan, have elections and opposition, but effectively the elections are purely facade and sort of meaningless. But in a number of countries like Hungary and Turkey and El Salvador and others, you actually have elections that are authoritarian, but nonetheless are genuinely competitive. So these are what we call sort of competitive authoritarian regimes. And that's the kind of country that the United States is right now. For a democracy to survive as a democracy, there needs to be kind of an arm's length relationship between arms of the state and politicians. I mean, the state is involved in all sorts of activities that has tremendous impact on the livelihood of citizens. And if those agencies that are at the beck and call of politicians, they can be used to punish and harass opposition. So really core to a democracy is this arm's length relationship between the politician and these agencies, which maintains the neutrality of these organizations, such that a prime minister can't simply call for an investigation of a political rival. So the first thing that happens in places like Poland and Hungary and Turkey is you have a purging of the career civil servants who are kind of loyal to the constitution of that country rather than the leader, and replaced by kind of loyalists who are loyal to the leader. And this is basically what you saw in early 2025 in the United States. So that's kind of the first step. And once the leader has sort of loyalists in power who controls the state, then they can do things like harass opposition leaders, audit their taxes and the like.
Yeah. It sounds like this is a gradual process, so it takes a lot of time, but Trump has sped this up in the past year.
In most sort of standard cases, it's actually taken a decent amount of time. So in Hungary, Orban came to power in 2010. It took about a year to establish a competitive authoritarian regime. In Turkey, it actually took about 7 or 8 years, a very long time. And it was done through sort of constitutional change and the like. Trump literally did it within a few weeks after coming to power, partly because he was very successful at imposing his kind of loyalists in places like the Department of Justice and the FBI. So that was, he really did it amazingly quickly.
You co-wrote a piece for the New York Times several months after Donald Trump took power, and you were questioning how Americans will actually know when they've lost their democracy. Was there a key moment this year when you thought, okay, this is the tipping point?
To me, the key moment was when Trump chose to punish law firms. Their only sin had been to represent Democratic Party clients or sort of represented opposition to Trump. And so he basically deprived them of security clearance and access to federal buildings and basically their ability to function and make money. And this has really sort of demonstrably raised the cost of citizens engaging in perfectly legal, constitutionally prescribed activity. And so that's kind of when I consider the transition to be between when the U.S. was a democracy and then when it became a competitive authoritarian regime, which is basically in early March, late February. What's been stunning is the incredibly wide range of politicized investigations of both kind of rivals, past and present. What's interesting is you have people like James Comey, who's the former director of the FBI, who is no longer really a relevant political figure, but this is someone who has antagonized Trump in the years past, and he's been investigated.
On social media, Trump called Comey, quote, guilty as hell, adding, nothing is being done and we can't delay any longer.
We have to act fast. If they're not guilty, that's fine. If they are guilty or if they should be charged, they should be charged. And we have to do it now.
You also have people like John Bolton, again, a member of his administration, who, again, is sort of not a political force now. But then you also have people like Adam Schiff and others, Letitia James, who's the Attorney General for New York State, who, are really kind of involved in sort of actively opposing Trump today. And again, he's sort of announced investigations of them, as well as of George Soros and others. So it's a mix of sort of, real contemporary opposition, but also kind of a number of these kind of what might be called has-beens.
Why is targeting the opposition so necessary? What does this do for the autocrat moving forward?
In other kind of countries with weaker justice systems, you can literally jail members of opposition or bankrupt them. I mean, in a country like the United States, where the rule of law is quite robust, this is not possible. You can't just jail rivals at will and sort of disable the opposition that way. But investigations, even if you're proved innocent, are incredibly costly to people that, they have to spend their life savings, their reputation is undermined. So it's actually quite easy, if you have a politicized Department of Justice, to really kind of make life quite difficult for people who are sort of opposed Trump. And what this does is, it, first of all, kind of distracts people who would otherwise, like Letitia James, who might otherwise be engaged in activity to oppose Trump. She's having to focus all of her kind of mental energy on simply staying out of jail and hiring lawyers and stuff. But you also have the sort of knock-on effect that those around her see what happens and they engage in kind of self-censorship, and because they don't want to get in the crosshairs of the president, so they are much more kind of, reluctant to sort of engage in behavior that they know that Trump won't like. So it really has this kind of broader, kind of silencing effect that I think is quite pernicious.
We'll be right back.
Every week, Michelle Grattan offers you a ringside seat to the latest in Australian politics with interviews and insights from political insiders. On the Conversations Politics with Michelle Grattan podcast, we cut through the spin and get to the substance with independent analysis of the issues that really matter. Stay informed, search and follow Politics with Michelle Grattan wherever you get your podcasts.
Lucan, in suppressing opposition, where is Donald Trump's inspiration coming from?
Hungary has definitely been seen as a sort of model for Trump. I mean, I think, the Hungarian case is particularly interesting because Orban, first of all, emerged in a very consolidated democracy, Hungary, which had 5 different democratic turnovers before he came to power in 2010. This was a country that was pretty wealthy, high income, like the United States, very established democracy. And yet he was able to sort of transform Hungary into an authoritarian regime. And what's also interesting, he did so very legalistically and with very few sort of what we would consider civil liberties violations and the like. So this was definitely the model. But in fact, what's interesting is, first of all, Trump, as I mentioned, has gone much quicker, but he's also run much more roughshod over the law, engaging in behavior, which is clearly violates the Constitution. For example, the tariffs. And also you have sort of the agency of ICE, which is involved in targeting migrants, and they've engaged in all sorts of, detentions of citizens without due process. So he's really run roughshod over the law to a degree that we actually don't see in Hungary. That surprised me.
Going back to Orban for a moment, can you talk about the ways that he targeted the opposition specifically? What did he do when he came into power?
So the first thing he did was he engaged in constitutional reform, which allowed the government much greater control over the courts and judges, and his ability to appoint and sort of fire judges and appoint loyalists. That's one thing, which actually, Trump hasn't done. I mean, he's relied on the existing judges. He hasn't sort of engaged in any kind of more fundamental institutional change. But Orban also did stuff with the media, which was in some ways, much more subtle, but also, more similar to what Trump is doing, which is kind of politicizing the regulatory agencies by, for example, threatening to sort of withhold a license renewal for certain websites and television stations in exchange for sort of more favorable coverage.
Hungarians have taken to the streets to protest the erosion of critical media.
This is stuff that Orban engaged in, quite behind the scenes and, with a high level of deniability. There was this website called Orgo, which was a quite well-known website in Hungary. It was very critical. It had the highest traffic in Hungary. And rather than simply shutting it down, he basically encouraged the owners to sell. And the tender itself was actually quite above board, but he kind of Orban-tied banks gave money to one sort of pro-Orban company, which was able to buy the website and transform it from a kind of independent website to a very kind of pro-Orban website. So the important thing is all this stuff was without violence. It was all behind the scenes. You had to really look hard to sort of see where the violation was. And I think this is kind of, in some ways, the sort of brilliant technique, because there really is very little to protest. That's why there's a kind of evil brilliance behind Orban's activity, which I think to a certain extent they're mimicking.
Russia is different from the U.S. in many respects. Turkey is different from the U.S. in many respects. The U.S. has this robust democratic tradition. Do those guardrails help at all? Is this stopping Trump from stifling the opposition in any way?
Well, I think a couple of things are. I think that, what you saw in the case of James Comey, where there was this very kind of all-thumbs effort to indict him, and the institutions actually functioned, the judge threw out the indictments because they violated procedure in a kind of really severe way. In other cases, the guardrails have not functioned, and the Supreme Court in the United States is not really done anything to stand up to Trump, and so that's been quite different. But I think in general, in a sense, there's the other aspect in which the United States is highly advantaged compared to other authoritarian regimes like Hungary. First of all, the opposition is much more unified. I mean, the Democratic Party is quite a viable political party. It's, quite unified, quite well financed, quite well organized. I mean, it's a really sort of powerful opposition force in a way that you did not have in Hungary, where opposition was highly divided between kind of far right and far left and sort of much less well-resourced. And in general, civil society in the United States is quite robust. So it's really hard to kind of stifle opposition the way in civil society, the way it was done very easily in Russia or in Hungary.
There's been protests this year. The No Kings protests have been fairly large, but it seems like the public outrage has seemed somewhat subdued, or it comes and goes. Do you feel that this is an impact of that chill that Trump's attacks on the opposition have had?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that I think, the level of protest has been quite, it hasn't certainly been totally silent. And the No Kings were, in all 50 states, and it was quite large and stuff. But I think you're right that there hasn't just been the popular reaction. I think that's quite puzzling. I think it partly could be the silence. I also think the reality is that even in an authoritarian regime, it negatively affects a fairly small percentage of the population. And so most people, unless they're like deeply invested in politics and follow it very closely, the truth is that for most people, politics is the sideshow and the circus of life. And also, I think the other issue is that perception is that the United States has no experience with authoritarianism. The United States, constitutional system is much more fragile than people thought.
Lucan, thanks for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
You can read more political analysis at The Conversation. This episode was produced by Isabella Podwinski, sound designed by Michelle Macklem. Our head of audio is Gemma Ware, and our head of editorial innovation is Ashlyn McGee. Misha Ketchel is the editor of The Conversation Australia, and Stephen Kahn is the editor-in-chief of The Conversation UK. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organization. You can sign up to our free daily newsletter by clicking the link in our show notes. You can also listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.